So where Russia was focusing on Europe and Ukraine and building a buffer zone, they to some extent have lost the buffer zone in the south, and not yet, but is in the process of losing in the east.
The South Caucasus are particularly interesting. They always have been. Listeners and viewers will no doubt know a lot of that history. I mean, but talk us through the sort of geography there. Why the South Caucasus, or Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia? Why it's so important to Russia?
Well, to put it this way, these countries were part of Russia. They were part of the Soviet Union. The president of Azerbaijan, Aliyev, his father was headed the KGB for a while. These were Russian states. They may have spoken a somewhat different language, but this was pretty much like losing, let's say, Washington State along the northern American border. And when you look at what the United States offered them, they were able to offer them tremendous access to the United States, not having tariffs really heavily placed on them. They were able to offer engineering a road that fundamentally changed geography. Armenia and Azerbaijan had fought wars very recently over an area called Nagorno-Karabakh, which separates them. This road links them together, and while there was hesitation on the part of the Armenians, they see the benefits of being associated with Azerbaijan, a very wealthy country based on oil. Okay. And that means that Armenia, which has tense relationships with Turkey, now has another option. At the same time, the Americans have the possibility, even the capability, to build forces south of the Caucasus. The other side of the Caucasus is still Russian, but this was the area like Chechnya and the area between them that also was hostile, and they repressed rather brutally. So the South Caucasus, the Caucasus north of the mountains, are part of Russia, but that's a fundamental vulnerability. And there's relationships between South and North Caucasus, and therefore there is another threat in an area that has a essential instability. Now with the United States in a dominant position, not in the sense of having military forces there, but in terms of diplomacy and economics and bringing them together, they have to look at what happens in the countries that revolted against them. Back in the day, Chechnya as such was one of these countries. And now they have to look at the East as well. So this monomaniacal view of Ukraine, that the Ukrainian issue is the central issue and no others. What the United States has handed themselves is a set of other issues, to some extent even more vital. So where Russia was focusing on Europe and Ukraine and building a buffer zone, they to some extent have lost the buffer zone in the south, and not yet, but is in the process of losing in the east. So think of 3 Ukraines, coming around the Russians, which was going to make them thoughtful.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because a few weeks ago on the podcast, we were talking about the Caribbean and Venezuela and how Russia was in some ways trying to open a distraction for the US there, or may potentially have been. That was a possible theory. Similar thing seems to be happening from the US perspective in this, along the southern Russian border. Let me ask about that, because as you say, the Russians have been distracted looking at Ukraine. Why are they more worried about Ukraine than their southern border? Or was this a mistake? Is it just down to NATO? I mean, what's the story there?
This war is going on for 4 years. Their feeling at the time was they didn't have any problems to the east. They didn't have any problems to the south. They were free to focus on Ukraine. They never, in their wildest dreams, thought that 4 years later, the war would still be going on. Okay? So when they attacked Ukraine, they expected a rapid evolution, reaching a conclusion in months, if you will. Okay? but didn't happen. So they didn't expect to be in this position. But also, for the last 80 years, the Russian focus has been on Europe. They feel a genuine threat from NATO. We might say you can't be serious, but they are, because, for example, they made a treaty with Hitler, a non-aggression pact, which he broke. And they had assumed that Russia would never dare attack Russia itself. It was so vast. They did. And so it's rational for any nation to think about the worst case scenario and not overestimate their position. And what happened was the Russians overestimated their power in the south and the east, thought that would not become a challenge, and also never thought that this war, which would teach Europeans a lesson of not thinking about war with Russia, actually thought of a very different lesson of being more worried about Russia and creating a greater threat. So the way it worked out was not at all as Putin expected. And I doubt at the beginning of the war, Trump had any interest in these areas. But when Putin refused to reach an agreement with him, as well as indicating that he would, but using that to delay the war, he's now in a situation where that delay in the war has not brought him victory. And the United States has responded by, if you will, seducing or trying to seduce. The Eastern countries are not yet seduced. The South is. And they just never anticipated the length of the war, nor the extent to which the United States was prepared to do some very creative diplomacy, particularly under Trump.
I mean, speaking of worst case scenarios, could we see US military deployments in some of these countries, particularly in the South Caucasus, if they get close enough to the US? I mean, they're not far away in other places like Qatar.
The US involved itself in a Russian war in the South Caucasus with a country called Georgia. In Georgia, it was not quite in this line, and it's got a strange relation with Russia and being involved. But the U.S. did massively support the Georgians in a way limited, at least, and defeated the Russian attack. So the Russians made that attack to get the South Caucasus under control. They managed to get some significant influence over Georgia. They're not involved in this, but not in the other countries who became frightened by what he did. So what he did was what Trump did was take advantage of the focus of the Russians to create potential problems elsewhere. He's not yet created a problem for Russia, but has created a situation where in the South he might be able to generate that problem. And again, Aliyev's father was a KGB man. This was an intimate part of Russia, of the Soviet Union. And at the same time, Kazakhstan, which is where much of their missiles and nuclear tests took place, is now in a questionable position. So this issue would be like, what if Canada and Mexico went into a questionable position? That is, if the Russians took advantage of our tariffs on them and everything else to reach the court. This would be a good Russian strategy, not one that I think would succeed, but it would cause concern. So in this case, this has to be very much on Putin's mind, or if not on Putin's mind, on people around him.
Take a moment to follow and rate us on your preferred podcast platform. Subscribe on YouTube at Geopolitical Futures GPF. Click the link in the description for access to our free newsletter, and for a limited time, you'll receive an instant download of our special report on NATO's Eastern Line by senior analyst Antonia Kolobasanu.